works anyway. So we are 1 minute early. Can we start? I think there is nobody else coming. Let's do it. Good morning, everybody. I would start with a question. Who has tried MySQL 8? Good boys. For the ones who don't know me, my name is Giuseppe. I've been working with MySQL a long time. I currently work with VMware, doing things different from database, but I do database on my own just because I like it. And Fred asked me to remind you that there is a FOSDEM hashtag and MySQL dev room hashtag that you should use actively. So, roles. What are they? It's something that is available in MySQL since version 8.0, and something that is created like a user and granted like a privilege. And there is the tricky part, the part that triggered me to prepare this presentation is that you need to activate them in order to use, and there are a couple of problems or tricks, but we'll see. So before roles, meaning in MySQL up to 5.7, what did you have to do to authorize somebody to use a database? You create a user, and then you grant to that user. Then we have another user which similar access. So you create the user and grant again a lot of things. Create the user, grant until you make a mistake. So it's a lot of repetitive work, and there is a lot of chances to make mistakes. So the advantage of roles should be easy to understand. First of all is faster user administration. You define a role, you assign many times, and so you have less possibilities of making mistakes. And then you have a centralized grants handling. This is, as a consequence, gives you also the possibility of having better grants statistics. So let's start with something practical. Let's start with a bad example, because you know, when you try something new, usually you end up with something that doesn't work. So we have created a role. We call it powerful. Then to this role we grant everything on every object in the database. Then we create a user. We give it a password, and then we grant the role to that user. So far, everything is according to the manual. Now, let's see if it works. So we connect with the new user, and we try use test, and it says access denied. And we show grants, and we see that the powerful, the role that should contain the privileges, is there. However, it doesn't work. So what has happened? We are going to find out soon. Stay tuned. Let me explain how the role usage works in MySQL 5.8.0. You create the role, first of all. Then you grant privileges to the role. We have seen that. Create the user, grant role to the user, and the missing piece was set the default role. You have to do something extra in order for that user to be able to use that role. Let's see in practical. We create a role, And notice that there is no identified clause when we create a role. We grant something to that role, create the user, and then grant the role that we have created to that user. Notice the difference when you grant a role is different from when you grant a regular privilege. There is no on clause in the grant statement. And then you set the default role. So you say alter user, default role, and the name of the role. Or you can use set default role, name of the role, and name of the user. You can do that in several ways, unfortunately. So a few points that you need to remember. First, the MySQL dev room hashtag, because Fred likes that. You can grant many roles to one user, and this is by design. You may want to have several roles that have one portion of the privileges that you want to create for a given work, and then assign several roles to a user. The roles don't have a specific table. The roles are saved in the user table. So basically, a role is a user without a login. And as a consequence of the previous point is that you can actually grant a user as if it were a role to another user. No, this is the next one. The point that I was making before, it was that when you grant the role, your job is not finished. You have also to activate the role. You have to set the role as default. And what I was saying before, it was that you can grant a user to a user. So you don't need to have a role specifically defined. You can say just grant user Shlomi to user Fred, and it will work. It will be a confusion between the two, but it works just like a role. Now, the most important part is that you need to set the role active. So you need to read the manual, and the manual gives you a bit of a headache. So set role means for this session, use this role as default. Set default role means forever, not only for this session. Assign this role to that particular user. And set role default means something completely different, meaning if this user has a default role and was using something different right now, give it back the default role. So if this is confusing for you, you are right. I hope that the MySQL team will do something better with this. So hailing roles from users. This is something that I would like to. As an administrator, I would like to know, can I list just the roles, but there is no feature for that. So the thing that you should do is to adopt a naming convention. For example, start the user, the roles with R underscore something, and only the roles will start that way. I know that there is a feature request for this, but I'm not holding my breath about that. Things that we do find, instead, there are a few tables related to roles. There is a role edges table that tells you which roles have been assigned to which users. And then there is a default roles that says which roles are default for the users. A funny thing is that in default roles, you can put mostly anything, even if the role does not exist. This is a bug for me. It's a philosophical question about, according to the developer who responded to my bug. So basically, the default role may not exist. And I hope that somebody will change their mind in the MySQL team and decide that the default roles should be something that exists. Otherwise, we go back to the problems that we had before the roles. So the roles in action, and don't forget about the hashtag. Let's suppose that we wanted to deal with the Lord of the Rings world using roles. So I have a role that is observer, another that is tester, another that is developer and DBA. And all these roles will go to act on a database called the Lord of the Rings. So what do? We assign the select to observer, select, insert, update, and delete to tester, all to the developer, and all on everything to the DBAs. So what do then? We assign the roles to the users, and we have users that, of course, belong to this database, and are Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Pippin, Merry, Boromir, Gimli, Aragorn, Legolas, Gandalf, Galadriel, and Gollum. And if you know the story, you know that the DBA go to Gandalf and Galadriel because they cannot go to anybody else. And the developers are Frodo, Aragorn, and Legolas. And the testers are Sam, Bilbo, and Gimli. So you see, we have several roles assigned to different users, and notice that I have set the default role for the right user, so they will work immediately. How do they look? If we look at the user table, you see that basically they look like user. The only thing is that they don't have a password because we created the role using the create role instead of create user. And that's it. So you can see that the roles start with R underscore. It's just my convention, not something that you are forced to. And that's it. So you see this, if you use the roles with a bit of organization, you should be able to find them. Now, using the roles, you can also use some different ways. For example, you can say the ones who have the password expired and account locked, they are roles. But you can have also regular users with the same characteristics. If you are adopting a naming convention, you can just select the users that start with the prefix that you wanted to use. You can see the role age that gives you which roles are assigned to which users, and the default roles, and you see the assignment of defaults. And then you can use specific queries to see which users have a particular role. For example, the DBAs are Galadriel and Gandalf. The developers are Aragorn, Frodo, and Legolas. And then you can use those tables just, with regular SQL to see how many DBAs you have, how many developers, how many observers and testers. Similar query. So when you have a user with a default role, you have a show grants, and you see that the grants here come explicitly. So you see that it has select, insert, update, and delete. And when you say select current role, you get the name of the role. If you don't have a default role, when you do the grants, you don't get the privileges, you get only the name of the role. So when you do a user without a default role, you try to use it and you get access denied just because the role is not active. You do a set role and you can enter the database and do whatever else you need to do. A thing to remember is that set role is not permanent. Set role is something that happens in the session. Is a question there? The question is what the current role shows if you have many roles assigned as default. It shows the list of roles that were assigned. Set role, select the current role, and you see the name of the role. Then you see that you can enter the database where you should enter. Then if you do a connect, meaning that you restart the connection, the set role expires and then the connection is denied. So let's go back to the bad example that we had at the beginning, and we were in this condition. So we have the powerful role that is assigned but is not active yet. So the thing that we need to do is set role powerful, and then show grants will show all the privileges that come with that role, and finally you can enter the database. One thing that is a piece of good news, in MySQL 8.02 there is a possibility of having roles active by default. So there is one option that it says activate all roles on login. And if you activate that option, every user that has a role, and when at the moment it connects, it will have the role active. So you don't need to do set role at all. Of course, you can do manually if you want to change the default role, but the default role will be active. And there is a strange thing that is called mandatory roles. Mandatory roles means set this role mandatory for every user. And I don't know, it could be useful or it could not. So with mandatory roles, let's see, we create a schema, we select, we grant something to this role, and then we say, this role now is mandatory for everybody. So everybody can see the Lord of the Rings tables. So I create a user, identified by mSandbox, and I don't give it anything. So when I connect with this user, I get an error. Why? Because the role is not active. But if I say also set global activate all roles on login equals 1, and then I try to connect again, then this dummy, which didn't have any privileges at all, it gets the mandatory role, and with this mandatory role, it's able to use the Lord of the Ring database. One strange thing that is a consequence of these mandatory roles is that if you already have the privileges provided by that mandatory roles, it doesn't matter. That mandatory role comes to you anyway. For example, the user root here has also the grants for the Lord of the Rings database, even though root can access already everything. Last thing, in MySQL 8.03, there is the possibility of saying, of putting the default role in the create user. So the create user is something that comes before assigned roles. So you can say create user blah blah, and default role is foo. But you need also to assign that role. So I don't know. I think there is some work to do on this, because yes, it's good that I can assign a default role. It would have been even better if I could also say, also I want this role to be not only the default, but really to exist for that user. Which you know, if you do things this way, you say set default role during the create table, create user, you end up with a user that has a default role and no role. It's complicated, yes, it is. So, end of time. I can answer a few questions, and don't forget the hashtags.
Do you see any use case for assigning roles without activating?
No.
One comment, maybe I should just open a bag. I think like set default role with multiple roles are concerned is probably not what we would want. We want add and remove, or otherwise whenever I want to add a new role, I need to query all the existing roles.
Open a bag. What happened when you delete a role that was assigned? The next time that the user connects, it will not be allowed to use that role. So if you delete a user, the default role remains, unfortunately. So it's something that should have disappeared, but it doesn't. So the question is, do you need to specify set role every time? No. If you have a set default role, then that role will come every time you connect. It's a SQL command, so you need to specify whichever client you want to use. Yes, you can assign several roles as default. Last question? It's very. I didn't hear the last part. Yes, it is.